When I planted my first garden over 35 years ago, I made so many mistakes. Let's make sure that you don't make the same ones. My mother was a gardener, and while I helped her in the garden with the weeding and the harvesting, it was her garden, and I thought she just went out and stuck plants into the ground. So I didn't know if she had a plan or if she was just winging it. And I never asked her, which I do regret. But she always seemed to have the harvest she wanted and plenty of tomatoes and green beans to can for the winter. So I'm pretty sure she had a plan. Not me. When I was able to plant my first garden at my first home, I went to the nursery and bought 40 tomato plants. 40! I was a single mother with a full-time job, and I planted 40 tomato plants. I didn't have time to weed 40 plants, so the weeds got away from me. But the tomatoes kept growing, and then they started producing fruit, which was great until I was drowning in tomatoes and didn't have time to can them. We ate tomatoes until we were sick of tomatoes. I took tomatoes to work until they asked me to stop. Fortunately, my mother took many of them so that she could can them, but what was I thinking? 40 tomato plants for me and a 6-year-old. That's crazy. Before you start planting your garden, you need to plan your garden. Are you going to can your produce? If so, maybe you do need 40 tomato plants. But if not, how many tomatoes will you and your family eat fresh this summer? Even if you really love tomatoes, depending on the variety, I would recommend only 1 or 2 plants for each person who plans to eat lots of tomatoes. Which brings us to the second thing you'll need to think about. I chose a horrible location for my first garden. As I mentioned before, I was a single mother and I wanted my son to have the largest amount of space to play in the backyard, so I put the garden behind the garage so it wouldn't get in his way. That was great for my son, but not such a great place for the garden. The garage blocked the sun for a larger part of the day than was ideal. This likely decreased my tomato yield because nearly all vegetables require 6 to 8 hours of sunlight each day to produce their maximum harvest. Before you put any plant into the ground, you need to find out what its ideal growing situation is. Some plants actually like a bit of shade, especially in the hot afternoons, so research your crop before you plant. If your yard is mostly shady, you may want to plant beets, brassicas, carrots, celery, horseradish, peas, or radishes. Not all plants want the same amount of water. Some plants are water hogs, while others like the soil to be a bit more dry. Because I was a busy woman, I'm afraid there were many times that if we didn't get rain, I would forget to water my tomatoes. Fortunately, tomatoes are pretty forgiving if they get a bit dry, and we did get a lot of rain that year. But I could have lost my whole crop because of my ignorance and neglect. You need to understand your plants and what their watering needs are going to be. Asparagus, cabbage, celery, cucumbers, and melons are examples of plants that like the soil to be moist all the time, but not soggy. Soggy soil can lead to root rot and loss of your harvest, so give these plants about 2 inches of water every week. On the other hand, okra, peppers, some varieties of squash, and most herbs can tolerate and may prefer drier conditions. Planting your vegetables in wet zones and dry zones can help you manage your garden more efficiently. If you plant the vegetables that like to have a couple of inches of water every week near each other, you won't be running back and forth across the garden to spot water this vegetable and that vegetable while trying to keep the dry-loving plants more dry. Groupings of plants that require similar conditions can help make your life easier. Also, plan your wet zone close to your water source if possible. That way you won't have to drag your hoses clear across the garden as often. If you are a new gardener, the most important thing you can do is to research the plants you want to grow, especially how much space they will take. If you have a small area to plant in, you probably won't want to plant watermelons that need at least 3 feet between plants and may need up to 12 feet. On the other hand, radishes don't require much space at all, and you can grow enough in containers on a small balcony to keep yourself in radish sandwiches most of the summer. When shopping for plants or seeds, the label should tell you how much space the plants will need. Another great source of information about growing requirements for almost any fruit or vegetable you can think of is almanac.com. If you are new to gardening, set yourself up for success. Don't pick a vegetable that is difficult to grow. Fortunately for me, tomatoes are easy to grow, and I had a very successful harvest my very first year. But not all vegetables are easy. Because brassicas such as broccoli and cauliflower do not like heat, They must be planted for a late spring or fall harvest. If you plant these and then the weather gets hot, they are going to bolt and you won't get any harvest. While potatoes can be easy to grow, they can also be plagued with potato beetles whose larvae can destroy the plants before the potatoes have a chance to develop. Other plants that can be a challenge because of pest pressure include melons and squash. Carrots can be difficult to get to germinate, and if the soil isn't loose enough for the roots to spread into, you can get some funky looking carrots. I still have difficulty getting carrots to sprout and have only had one good harvest, ever, in 35 years. But I'm going to try again this year. For your first garden, you may want to consider lettuce, zucchini, radishes, or green beans, which are fairly easy to maintain and get a great harvest. There is nothing like an easy harvest in your first garden to give you the confidence to try something a little harder next year. Along these same lines, don't plant too much for your first garden. Getting overwhelmed because you planted a quarter of an acre of garden for your first time will not make you want to grow another one next year. If you are growing in the ground, a 10-foot by 10-foot area is probably plenty for you to handle while you are just developing your garden skills. You can grow a bigger garden next year. We have been experiencing fall spring this year. Fall spring is when you have a few days that are warmer than normal, and it will lead you into the delusion that it's time to plant the garden. Do not believe fall spring. More than likely, winter will be back at least once before you reach your last frost date, when it will be time for you to set out most of your plants. It's important for you to know your first and last frost dates so that you don't lose those garden plants to a hard frost or even a freeze because you got carried away by the lying weather. You can find your first and last frost dates by your zip code on almanac.com or garden.org. If you don't know any other dates, including your children's birth dates, if you want to be a successful gardener, you must know your first and last frost dates. Thank you for stopping by the Old Mayfield place today. Stay prepared, plan that garden wisely, and have a blessed week.